I'm Amanda Weber, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis.
I'm Gia Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of McCormick Theological Seminary's Solidarity Building Initiative.
Westminster and McCormick are coming together to present Isolation in Perspective:
Criminal Justice, Disconnection, and the Church. This multi-week educational series seeks to explore the impact of COVID-19 on the carceral system and the role of the church in responding. Each week, this series will feature a variety of speakers focusing on the topics of criminal justice, disconnection, and the church.
We invite you to join the conversation live via Zoom on Tuesday evenings at 6 p.m. or through Westminster's Sunday morning adult education hour at 9:15 a.m., which will rebroadcast Tuesday's live session.
So each week, we're going to begin the sessions with a grounding exercise
to help bring us more fully into the present moment so that we may be open to all this time has to offer us, opening ourselves to challenging topics and changing hearts.
We are so glad that you have decided to join us today. So now we're going to begin to prepare for our grounding exercise. So again, my name is Gia Johnson, and I'm going to guide you through this grounding practice. So I'm going to invite you just to kind of get comfortable and settled in right wherever it is that you find yourself. For those that are able, I invite you to root your feet to the earth as if the earth is rising from beneath you. For others, you might want to imagine that your feet are rooted to the earth and imagine the earth rising from beneath you. Perhaps even get broad in your chest, maybe move your shoulders a bit, kind of just get a little bit relaxed and loosen up some. Begin to turn your attention and your awareness to your breath. Just begin to hear the sound of your breath. I invite you to inhale slowly and then exhale. Inhale slowly and then exhale. And do that one more time. Inhale and then exhale. So inhale what it feels like to be rooted and connected to life-giving community. Those communities that usher in wholeness and healing when harms have been committed. And exhale a desire for others to experience the peace of shalom that bears the fruit of compassion, healing, and wholeness. Inhale what it feels like to know God through the works of your justice making. Exhale your collective passions to be co-laborers with God in making justice for those whom have been made to be oppressed. Inhale what it feels like to bear witness to God doing a new thing in and through you and your community and in the world. And exhale a receiving of the invitation to be co-creators with God in making a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Begin to prepare yourself to be present for this conversation. Prepare your mind and your body and your spirit by gathering your desires for others to experience the peace of shalom, your collective passions to be co-laborers with God in justice making, and your invitation to be co-creators with God in imagining into existence new life-giving ways of being. So begin to, if your eyes are closed, I invite you to take a few more seconds And then begin to open your eyes. Begin to prepare your body and your mind and your spirit to be present for this conversation on this day at this time. Amen and Ashe.
Welcome to this morning's kind of pre-launch into a 6-week series where Westminster is partnering with McCormick Seminary in Chicago. This first day is a little bit of a focus just on Westminster's explorations around the topic of criminal justice. And so I'm delighted today to have a couple of folks joining us from a team that worked on the criminal justice statement that came out of Westminster. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So again, my name is Amanda, and I'll turn it over to our friends to introduce themselves. Vivian, you want to get started?
Sure. My name is Vivian Jenkins Nelson, and I'm a professor at Luther Seminary. I'm an adjunct there, Oxford University, and I teach in a women's leadership course in the Center for Purposeful Leadership. I am a senior fellow at Oxford, and earlier in life I was a young social worker, and then went into counseling, and then went into social psych. So that's me in a nutshell.
And Vivian, how long have you been a member at Westminster?
Well, I just looked that up since 2014, but I've been coming to Westminster for over 40 years with my husband, who was a member.
Cool. Great, thanks. And Sandy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sandy Wolfwood, and I am a member at Westminster. I'm a designer by training. I have recently taught at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, so I have this odd connection between design and problem solving, community engagement, which has also translated to some of the work I've done at Westminster. I lead the eco-justice team there and serve on Faith in Action, and also on the Westminster Town Hall Forum Board. I've been a member since 1982, but we were out of the cities for about 10 years and came back to join. So I may not be the furthest one from Westminster, but when we moved back, I was really firm about wanting to stay at Westminster, even though we live in Stillwater, Minnesota, so driving from Stillwater.
Great, thanks. And again, my name is Amanda. I'm the Minister of Music and the Arts at Westminster, and mostly my role today is just serving as kind of a moderator of our small group. I was not at Westminster in 2017 when you all took on this project of creating a criminal justice statement. So I'm very curious to hear more today about that process. So Sandy, you had mentioned earlier to me that there's a larger team that was a part of this. So maybe you could say a little bit about how this project came to be and who was involved.
Sure. So we actually had our start in late fall of 2016. I think our first meeting was in December of that year. These public statements that of which the Criminal Justice Reform Task Force statement is a part really had their start at Westminster back in the early 2000s when Doug Mitchell, our pastor, and I can't remember it. It's different from Elena's title now, but Elena Tyler is the one who replaced Doug's in that position. But Doug really called us to account on using our voice at Westminster to advocate for things we believe in. And this was the most recent of the statements that we have done. And that process really has its beginnings in the social justice team here at Westminster, where through lots of discernment and input to that team. That team makes a suggestion to the session of the church that we study a particular topic, and we form a task force on it. And in this case, criminal justice reform and mass incarceration had been percolating in the news for quite a while, and especially due to, I think, two things at Westminster. I think it was in 2014, we had Brian Stevenson come speak at our town hall forum. And many of our attendees today may have read the book Just Mercy or seen the movie that came out last year called Just Mercy, about the incarceration of particularly young Black men. And then a lot of us had also read Michelle Alexander's book, right, The New Jim Crow, which is about essentially replacing slavery and Jim Crow with mass incarceration, again, of young Black men. And so this became a topic that we felt our congregation needed to delve into and to come out with a position statement on that we could use for advocating.
Great. And you said that team was like 9 people or something?
Yes, it was a team appointed with Tim Hart Anderson's input, assembled, and we had 9 people, one of whom was our pastor liaison, Doug Mitchell. But on that team, I'm just going to go down the list of people, if you don't mind, read their names and sort of their backgrounds. We have Nancy Brazel, who at the time was a district court judge for Hennepin County. Taylor Crouch Dodson, who was an intake administrative officer for the Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights. Kelly Jepson, who was at Luther Seminary as a candidate, MDiv candidate, and served as a chaplain, prison chaplain. Bridget Letnes, statewide recidivism reduction project supervisor for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Bill Linder-Scholler, who is retired but had been a director of community affairs at one point. Gwen Martin, who was a police officer and paramedic with Cottage Grove Police Department. And then lastly, who is also on the panel today, Vivian Jenkins Nelson, in addition to myself, and I was the chair of the task force. So it was quite a broad range of people.
Thanks, Sandy. Vivian, what do you recall about pulling this group together?
Oh, I remember the many varied discussions that were very intense, and I learned something every time we met. So that was a very good process. Sandy is very good at designing these sorts of things. And I liked very much working with the young people who were fresh eyes for us. And finally, having a focus group with some folks who had just left the corrections system and getting their input on what we were looking at, which I think really added a dimension, a really nice dimension to it.
Oh,
so
great. Now, before we jump into the statement specifically, I just want to take a moment for our viewers to show you how to get to the criminal justice statement online. So I'm just going to share my screen here and you'll see Westminster's homepage. And from here, you would go to ACT and Social Justice. That takes you then to the page of all of our kind of faith in action ministries. And if you scroll down all the way to the bottom, here are these many statements that Sandy alluded to on various topics, and this one is calling for systemic change. So clicking on that would take you directly to the document, 41 pages long, again, written in 2017. So I do hope that folks will download that and read it. And it's interesting to me that here we are 3 years later, and kind of is struggling ever more so with this same topic, particularly with all that's been happening in the last few weeks in Minnesota and across the country. I wondered, so one of the first sections in this statement, which is common for a church statement on an advocacy topic, is the biblical underpinning. So why we would take this on as a church. And I wondered if you all might speak to that. What I wrote down, the topic that comes up a lot is restorative justice versus retributive justice. And if we can kind of just do a little intro of the difference of those and what that has to do with our faith.
I'll jump in there and talk a little bit about that. And I also wanted to bring us back a little bit to the process, because I think that was very important on why we got to the place that we did. We dove into this report and really needed to understand what we should be studying. It's a huge topic. As Vivian talked about getting together and the meetings, we had our first meeting in December, and we sat there overwhelmed by what we should do, didn't we, Vivian?
Yeah,
and I remember we set up a timeline of how we should go through this process, because these typical reports take no less than a year to do, because it's so important to listen and learn. So part of what you're referring to in that very front part of the report is explaining, number one, why we ground ourselves in statements of our tradition, of our faith, and why we felt it was going to address, going to fall along the lines of restorative justice, as opposed to looking at as a problem of addressing, of applying penalty. And our statement, our denomination has made statements to the effect that we're looking for, what did I write down for this in particular, but restoring relationships. It's all about restoring relationships, and that everybody is redeemable. And our penal system is not set up that way right now. So we found that as a major issue to address. One of the statements that came out of Michelle Alexander, which is a statement that actually leads off the report, says, as a society, our decision to keep shame and contempt upon those who struggle and fail in a system designed to keep them locked up and locked out says far more about ourselves than it does about them. So it was as much a mirror on ourselves as anything else. Vivian, did you want to say something?
If I can leap in here for a minute, I think one of the compelling parts of it in the biblical statement was really about, at least for me anyway, was about setting the captives free, that Doug wrote in that beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And our society punishes people in prison, and even when they're free, they're not free. They're still hooked through the probation system, and they can end up back in prison. There are so many ways that they can end up back in prison that ought not to be there. And so having that biblical underpinning was very important to me, because I think it gives people somewhere to stand, as Martin Luther said.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an area where everybody Black has a relative that's been in jail, because there are more men in prison now than were in slavery, some of the figures say.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. And the other thing too about it that used to drive me crazy when I was a young social worker going into a federal penitentiary to work with black inmates, was that they were making gloves, and I think they were making like 30 cents an hour at the time, something absolutely ridiculous. And it was just slavery. It was another form of slavery.
Oh.
And so anyway, for me, it's not only setting the captives free, but also setting us free from this very, what's the word I'm looking for, Sandy? It's kind of a mean-spiritedness.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the words that stood out to me, Vivian, related to what you're saying is the biblical concept of shalom, which you all mentioned in the statement. The statement talks about how restorative justice is about healing the community and healing the harm that has been done. And healing means a return to wholeness. And that concept of shalom is kind of a way to look at wholeness. And it just struck me differently in this reading than I had also read the statement 2 years ago. We often define shalom as peace, and I just kept thinking of no justice, no peace, which is this chant that we have been proclaiming following the death of George Floyd, and so the work that we aim to be doing in the criminal justice system is about the restoration of peace and wholeness for the whole community.
Mm-hmm. I don't mean to talk too much here, but it was just this week that I made the connection between what sounds, may sound to some people as aggressive, the chant, no justice, no peace, but it comes from the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Peace, peace, you say peace. Well, where can you have peace without justice? The prophet said.
Yeah.
So when I put that together, it made even more sense to me. And I found it, what's the word? I found it more effective, really, for me. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think a lot of people are chanting it and not knowing that it is a biblical concept.
Mm-hmm.
Vivian, you mentioned the intersection of race and the criminal justice system, and so I wanted to kind of turn into that land of intersections, because there's a lot of them, right? And we see this in this statement talking about the intersection of incarceration and poverty, incarceration and homelessness, incarceration and mental health. Sandy, you said this was in some ways such an overwhelming project, and I wonder how you all kind of took on these intersections. How do you stay focused on this process without having it take you into not just this one injustice, but like every injustice that exists?
Well, we had about a month and a half where we set aside a period of time for everybody to start reading. A lot of people brought a lens from their particular occupation, but we wanted people to read, and then we gathered back and started to put everything on the table. And that meeting was a very intense one because people felt very strongly about particular parts of this problem. And I think that, to me, and maybe Vivian can share her feelings about this too, but to me, and especially in chairing this and trying to make sure voices were heard and we ended up in a place that we could manage walking through this, that was the most difficult part of the process. And we had to throw some things out, and we had to say, this is too big. So for instance, policing. It was a place where a lot of people wanted to go, but we decided that it would take up the entire report, plus it would just take up more than the entire report. So we ended up wanting to address we came up with some statements that helped us frame it. And one was, we wanted to look at reducing incarceration in responsible ways. So that's one of the chapter titles. And then the other chapter titled, and I think Vivian was essential in helping us look at it this way, was improving the lives of those who've been impacted by incarceration. And that allows us to go for how can we positively, especially a faith community, move forward in this direction. We may be able to be more impactful in these ways.
Well, one of my initial frustrations was that it was hard to talk about that very subject in this very white, well-to-do church. And I'm talking about now about families and children, you know, and being able to minister to those folks. Generally speaking, the Black church is very focused on this very thing, because I guess we have to be, but we also want to be. I mean, it's more than not just, but it's more than visiting people. It's also holding them in the community in a way that is supportive. But you have to know who they are to start with, and we weren't even able to learn who the people were in the congregation who might be suffering. I mean, you know, it was like, no, we can't talk about that, because it would be, you know, it would be revealing people's, you know, backgrounds that maybe shouldn't be. And I'm like, you know what? It's public. It's, you know, these are public records. Everybody can see anybody's background now on computer. There is no hiding the fact that you've been in or you are in prison. But it's such a more, it's right, it's an in-your-face kind of issue in the Black community. And so there is maybe shame, but not in the same way I think I feel it in the white community. You know, I may be wrong about that, but.
No, I think that's a great point, Vivian, that it's such a taboo topic, specifically in the white community, and which doesn't align with the fact that there are many white people incarcerated, many, you know, white people struggling with drug addiction, alcohol addiction in this state specifically. So it's not that the white community isn't being affected. They just are afraid or ashamed, I think, to talk about it. And I think it's a great point that part of what needs to happen is a reframing of the language that we use around this topic, that it's you know, something that not to be ashamed of, but to support one another in. And I so appreciate it. I wanted to mention that the statement starts with a brief couple of paragraphs about language and the importance of language. And I wanted to add to that, actually, you all talk about, you know, not using words like felon and ex-offender and convict. We're trying to take these things out of our language. And one of the first things that was impressed upon me when I started working in the prison system was even going further, getting rid of inmate, offender, prisoner, to really focus on using people-centered language. And I think that in some small way, I think that's at the root of this shame that we've developed culturally over time, that we can't look at people as people, and, you know, issues as largely systemic in many ways. And then as soon as we assign them to a person, then we get caught in this unfortunate and not helpful cycle of shame. So I think that's a great point.
I would just like to bring up, I love that you pointed that out, Amanda, because many of us, that for those who had been working in this space for a while, I think they had to teach us why that was such an othering move. And there's been a lot of talk about othering. I was thinking a little bit about this in terms of the word homeless. Some people talk about the homeless, but when you talk about the homeless, it looks like a permanent, you are what your situation is at a very, given time. And so we now talk about people experiencing homelessness. It's a very different thing. And in the same way, people who get labeled, as you talked about, in a way that's detrimental, that has followed them for the rest of their lives in so many ways around getting housing and getting jobs and getting being able to move on with their lives. And so the naming is very important. So thanks for bringing that up.
One of the things that you all mentioned in this statement is both seeing many organizations that are experiencing this silo effect. And I wonder if you can speak to that. So this concept of like everybody's doing their own thing, trying to create the same change. And there's just kind of an overall sense of helplessness to bring about the change. So you mentioned that side. And then you also mentioned encountering programs that you felt were working and things that were inspiring in terms of possible reform. And so I wonder if both of you could respond to some of the people you may have heard or talked to and some of the things that you saw that either inspired you or maybe aggravated you toward change.
Vivian?
Oh, Vivian, you're on mute there, so you'll need to unmute. There you go.
There's so many. It's hard to it's hard to get your arms around. One of the things that I found so insightful from the group of folks that I interviewed who had recently left prison, they said that the defense system was so broken. It was, the public defender system was so broken that there was no chance of getting a fair hearing or getting the kind of support that you needed in terms of things like the severity of the crime that you were accused of. And, they said over and over again in this group that, that they have a nickname for it, I can't remember now, but that the defense system is totally broken. So getting into prison, people plea bargain, and they're advised to do that very often because the public defenders are terribly overloaded. And I don't want to insult any public defenders. That's a fault of the system. It's not a fault of the workers in it. So I wanted to just point that out. So I'll yield to Sandy.
I think one of the most, surprising things for me was visiting the Washington County Jail, which is out here still are, and we all went in as a group. And one of the first questions we asked one of the officers who was taking us around was what percentage of people came into that prison with some sort of need for medication for mental illness. And the percentage was 95%. And when we talked about, I think the silo effect, and in our recommendations, we talk about changing that and also building in somebody like a social worker who can bring all of the different pieces that are impacting this problem together. Mental illness being huge.
Huge.
You talk about an intersection that is big, as is homelessness. They all work together. I mean, so many of these livability factors come together, and so many of those people end up in jail because right now our system is set up for sending them to jail versus any other place. So that's why the silo effect, I think, piece was so important. Other things that I think Minnesota is doing well, and this became clear when we did some really, we had some fascinating listening sessions. So being in that prison was one, and also a session we had with Hennepin County judges. And out of that came some shared experience around treatment courts and how Hennepin County has introduced treatment courts in I think it's, I don't know if it was the first, Vivian, but it was certainly innovative, where they pull out low-level issues like drugs, alcohol, things like that, and they have them as specialty courts, not treatment courts, specialty courts, where they can deal with certain issues that are low-level demeanors, and they kind of separate that out so that you're dealing, you've got social workers involved, and it becomes less about a criminal situation and more about a treatment situation. So that's one thing I liked. What are some other things, Vivian, that we addressed that you thought were good?
One of the things that we addressed was the bail situation. And that keeps more people in jail who have not yet gotten into the court system. I mean, they can't post bail, so they have to, we're talking money here. And we've already said the intersection of poverty is very high. Mental illness, homelessness. And so where are you going to come up with all this bail money, And so you sit in prison. You just sit, or you sit in the jail. And you sit, and you sit, and you sit. And so by my lights, you're already being punished before you've even been adjudicated. So that's something that just it has to go. I mean, there has to be some other way of holding people who have done egregious things. Bail. If we're going to have bail, it should be, in my lights, it should be for the more egregious and so forth and so on. But $50,000 is the same as $1,000 if you're poor. If that's what your bail is.
Mm-hmm.
It's you can't meet anything, so it's irrelevant what the numbers are. But I wanted to also say that one of the things that I found very disturbing, as Sandy has said, is the mental illness that is encountered and how people don't get diverted to treatment or to care. They end up in jail. And when we were at the jail in Washington County, the warden told us about how having one person who has an episode can tie up 4 or 5 officers as they're trying to get that situation settled, and then it happens over and over again, and so it's like, so where's the care for people who can't afford it?
Mm-hmm.
And they shouldn't be in the prison system.
And on top of that, just a little anecdote that feeds into what Vivian just talked about. At the very end of our tour, Vivian, you may remember this, we asked the question after we were shown a solitary confinement cell about how, what was the process of releasing that anybody in that cell to society. Certainly they would go back into the general population and have a period where they had to adjust again to people around them. And that wasn't true at all. You could be released directly from a solitary cell out to the public And given the number of issues with mental illness that most of these prisoners had, that just could do nothing but exacerbate the situation. So I think we all just dropped our jaws on that one.
Absolutely. And I had, and one of the other things, speaking about language, one of the things that drives me crazy is for lack of a better term, sweetening up of some of the terrible language, which is to call solitary. Oh, they get real upset. We said solitary confinement. No, it's segregation. No, hell no. It's what it is, and stop sugaring it up. And it's horrible. And it's a form of torture. Can we talk? I mean, these issues are raised internationally in the international courts of isolating people for these periods of time. And I spent a day in maximum security prison in Stillwater, which I was just overcome by the airlessness of the place. I mean, it was just, I thought, if anybody in here has allergies of any sort, or asthma, or any breathing problems, they're going to be suffering in here. Really suffering. And I looked at the floor, and it was about this thick, and it was made out of resin, clear resin. And I said to them, they were bragging about the fact that you couldn't set a fire in there because if you lit something, if something was hot, like a cigarette or something like that, it would just melt in, the resin would just receive it and melt over it. So, and I said, so they had done this after the prison was built and people were in it. So I said, so the smell of this must have been really terrible and probably even toxic. So where'd you move them while you did this stuff? And they looked at me like I lost my mind. Well, they were still here. I was like, really? I was beside myself. And then I was later on doing some research over in Ramsey County in the jail. And you could smell that jail is closed now, but you could smell somebody making popcorn 2 floors down. And if everybody flushed the toilets at one time, there was no water. So I was beside myself. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to connect actually a couple of things that you all have said to COVID. So one being, Vivian, the health and safety of these facilities in the very first place, and imagining now COVID running rampant in several prisons across the country. I believe it's the 5 largest outbreaks in our country have been in correctional facilities. This is something that this series will dive a little more deeply into over the next 5 weeks to look at the impact of COVID, but also to circle back to solitary confinement, which is used not only to punish people, but in many cases, it has turned out to be the Department of Corrections sort of only way to what they think of as keep people safe. So, for example, in the case of people who are incarcerated who are transgender, people who are more likely to be targeted for abuse in a facility, oftentimes the solution will just be to put them in solitary confinement for protection. Same with COVID, we're seeing, people get sick or somebody's older and a vulnerable person who could get sick. The solution, put them into solitary confinement. And I think that then connects to, as you all were talking about, the intersection of mental health and the fact that not only are people coming into these facilities with mental health issues, but are being re-traumatized in many ways during their incarceration, and then sent out and expected to just be successful and re-enter with no problem. There was not a lot in this statement that I read about abuse, but as someone working in a women's facility specifically, that is another very related topic that comes up a lot. Of about 80% or more of the women at Shakopee have experienced abuse prior to coming to prison. Many of that is sexual abuse, and then things like strip searches in the context of prison are immensely triggering for the women to go through again.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we touched on just really briefly, but I want to mention is that this statement it's 40 pages, or I guess it's more like 30 once you cut out the footnotes. It's taking on so much. I mean, this is such a huge topic. And as I think you said, Sandy, what you kind of find as you start to unravel all of this is the need for reform pre-incarceration, like just the need for systemic reforms to keep people out of prisons, the need for reform of the incarceration system, and then also the need for re-entry reform so that people have more opportunity for success when they leave. I don't know if either of you could speak to any of that, but all three of those steps.
I'll take a stab at it. The courts need reforming.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not just the defense part of the equation, but people of color, and I include Native Americans as well as Black people, at least in this part of the country, get more severe sentences for the same crime. Okay, this is an injustice, but it's almost second nature in the systems. So I'll just stop with that. There was no way we could get into all of that, the sentencing stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and the changing of the guidelines, and and the sentencing of children to adult sentences in prisons is outrageous.
Yeah.
We need something that doesn't exist yet in the right way for juveniles who commit major crimes.
Yes.
So to build on that a little bit, we did look at things pre-incarceration in the prisons and post-incarceration, and thought of that, of what we were doing in those terms, and as Vivian just touched on, one of the pieces was juvenile justice, and we really wanted to do more with that. And again, like policing practices, and we felt that was a subject unto itself. One of the exciting things that happened is we held listening sessions with people in the congregation, and we did a number of them, I can't remember how many, was that people would bring this whole raft of issues that they knew about. People had been interested in studying and learning and listening. There's a lot we don't touch in this report, and it was really hard to leave it where we did. We heard a lot about public versus private prisons, that huge issue, where states are trying to make up budget shortfalls by building prisons and then turning them into private entities. It's kind of sad to turn it into an industry. Educational programs have been cut regularly in prisons, and we no longer, and that goes back to, we don't look at this as a rehabilitative role for government anymore. We look at it as a punitive or vengeful, and that was the whole point of the report, was to shift that thinking.
And it's a political issue when it should not be.
Right.
People running on these platforms, and every politician almost in the world, up until very recently, has had someone who has committed a severe crime, for lack of a better word, and they are running on law and order and showing that they're tough on crime. I guess that's the word, phrase I'm looking for. And so they pick one person and run on that person, you know. And I'm thinking, you know, this is too complex to just boil it down to tough on crime.
Mm-hmm.
Are you also tough on poverty? Are you also tough on child abuse? Are you also tough on sexual abuse? So let's talk about all these intersections that make for crime.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I read this year that just I was testifying at the legislature, and I passed out a study that had been done in the Journal of Pediatrics for the American um, Medical Association, and it was the first really big study that was able to look at every county in the country. And what they found was that due to poverty, children of color, particularly Black children more than others, end up abused or dead before the end of their first year of life. And we actually have starvation in this country. Children actually die of starvation. And what am I talking about? Well, you know, look at the lines that people are lining up to get baby formula, baby diapers, all of that stuff. These are folks, many of them who have been dashed into poverty because the economy has fallen apart. That stuff we know happens every day.
Mm-hmm.
Every day. And now we have the statistics to prove it. And so, you know, we deal with the microcosm, and that's a part of my social work life that I focused on, is on trying to reduce disparities among Black folks and the child protection system. And a lot of that boils down to poverty, literally.
Yeah.
And I was going to say quickly, and I know we need to wind up soon, is really intervention at early stages is where we landed. Many things on the report. If you can break that cycle, I think many of us have heard the term
the pipeline to prison.
Pipeline to prison. That is can be addressed in so many of the ways we talk about in the report: money and resources, and deciding that you're going to put that where it matters most. And instead of talking about how high your taxes are, think more about how do we mitigate this for the next generation.
So I want to add, so I think we've touched pretty well on the on pre-incarceration and incarceration, and just to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation, adding the reentry piece, that I think people just don't think about that. You know, people want safety in their communities. We all want to be safe. I think sometimes we forget that that's a desire for everyone. But so then we think, you know, we've locked people away. Great, we took care of it. But we forget that 95% of these people are coming back into the community, that 600,000 people a year are released from prisons. And just the level of success that they have in coming back is so low. And that is touched on in a couple places in the statement, both talking about people being re-incarcerated due to probation technicalities. I've seen that in my work with Voices of Hope at Shakopee. I've had singers leave and come back for just the silliest things. And also then just the inability to secure housing, to secure work. And so I think as long as we have this system in place, which is its own conversation, we need to be able to help people transition out of it. And I wanted to make sure that I mentioned Westminster's partnership with Better Futures in creating Great River Landing, which is an affordable housing unit for formerly incarcerated men. Again, have only been at Westminster for 2 years. I wondered, was Great River Landing a project that had been started prior to this statement?
Yep.
Okay.
But we were glad that that was already underway because it enabled us to mention it in the report, and also as an ongoing proposition, make people aware that this is a way that they could at least contribute to get involved.
And it's supportive housing, so people get services that help them re-enter. It's not just, a place to lay your head, although God knows people need that. But I want to speak to the fact that we have also not talked about illiteracy. And many of our folks who are in prison suffer from two kinds of illiteracy. One is just being able to read and write, and the other is computer literacy. And if you're going to even get, I'll just say quickly, my little church in the inner city, before I joined Westminster, was a little Lutheran church, and the poorest neighborhood in the Twin Cities. And our pastor gave a talk about the box. And the box was that when people came back from prison, there was nobody coming from anywhere saying, welcome back, let me help you get a job. No, you don't have a computer, let me guide you on how to do an interview, how to do, at the community level, this is pretty sketchy, okay? At least on the north side where we were. And so the box was the big drug dealers would bring a box. They'd get to them before anybody else. The week they got back, they knew when they were coming back. And they bring this box to them that had dope in it and had a proposition for them because they couldn't find a job. They weren't able to get housing, which is, you sell this dope for me, and I'll make sure that you get situated. So when we first came to the church, people were selling dope around the clock in our parking lot and on every corner going down the street that we were on. And so, it just speaks to the fact that we as the Christian community need to be better organized than the dope dealers, just to put it mildly. Okay.
Thanks, Vivian. That's a good way to put it, I think. So in our remaining time, and I think we can take about 10 more minutes, I want to ask you about the action steps, kind of the result of this project. If you feel that it's gone in the direction that you all had hoped as a task force, or if not, what hopes you have for it at this point, and particularly recognizing the unique position we're in now with a global pandemic and as the epicenter of the movement confronting our nation's long history of racialized violence. What do those things mean for us today? So what would you say about the action steps and what might be ahead for us?
So the report gives broad areas for action, not specific. And we did that intentionally because we wanted this report to have a longer life. And we also wanted to be able to continue the conversation. We knew we hadn't delved into enough pieces of the puzzle. A lot of these reports are really helpful as you advocate at the legislature. You can take this report on behalf of a large church like Westminster and say, this is what we recommend, and it's backed up by all of this information. This is a footnoted report. It's very valuable that way. Um, and we did things, as you mentioned before, mentioned recommendations such as combating the silo effect. These are broad categories for working, depending on what legislation comes up with the legislation. If I were to say what I would see going forward, I will not say that I'm sorry we didn't tackle it all then, but what I would love to see is use this as a jumping off place where we are now, as a place to delve more deeply into policing issues, because we are all becoming much more acquainted on the systemic nature of that, and what and perhaps build that into the role white privilege has played in all of that. So I think that we did a very good job in setting the stage and a place to build. I think we need to take it further, and I think it would be important for our church to do a series, do a task force, do something where we come out with some additional, not 30 pages necessarily, but some additional statements about some of these issues so that we can continue to use our voice in a powerful way. We are such a large church, and we have resources in many ways. We have talent, we have money. If we don't use that as allies in this cause right now, we are not doing our job as Christians.
Well, I'd like to share the fact that this report has got legs. Like Sandy, I'm a consultant as well, and I've worked in several of the counties that we're in, and I was able to share this report with the head of corrections for one of the larger counties. He was amazed that such a thing existed. And it supported some of the correction areas that he wanted to do. And basically, one of the things he did with it was he'd already done, but it supported his work to continue on it, was to separate the juvenile and adult prisons. He broke them up. So, so kids are no longer in the adult prison, which I was very grateful for. But I mean, some of the other things that we raised were, we were able to have some very deep conversations about them because he was clear that we knew what we were talking about. So, that I would love to see a conversation between people who run the systems. It isn't just a system, systems. Be able to have some kind of facilitated conversation about reforms. Because I think they could speak. Many of them, they're up against stuff like solitary confinement. And if they were able to speak because they didn't want it or like it particularly where we were visiting, I mean, they saw the inhumane part of it, but it's part of the system. So I'm wondering if folks who run the systems ever have a chance to talk together about reform and together be able to approach the legislature. I don't know. But it seems to me that they have a real opportunity to have a voice in making some of the reforms.
And I would just like to add, one of the things I learned in doing this report, that solitary confinement started out from a faith-based place.
Quakers.
Oh my God.
And it started out as a positive thing, meaning that Quakers felt that inner contemplation would lead you to enlightenment. And they went through maybe 100 years of this before realizing they were torturing people. And it created this big shift in how we approached criminal justice. But but it's interesting in that we often start out from a place where we hope to do, we hope to make meaningful and useful change, and we end up going the wrong direction. And I think right now we have an opportunity to create change where we are, and I hope we use it. I hope we use this window.
Now, Sandy, I think that story about the history of solitary confinement is such a good reminder that that faith communities wield power for better or for worse. And I was struck in to read on page 1 of the criminal justice statement. You all say that the task force hopes that congregations will use some or all of this partly in discussion with interfaith groups. And I do think about, if we were to come together with more and more other faith communities to really voice our opinion on these matters, that could create real change. And I also am, as we wrap up, I'm grateful for your suggestion, Sandy, to revisit this. Both of you mentioned this as kind of a launching point, that this statement has legs, it can go places. And I think, in reading the final recommendations, as an individual, I think it can feel really overwhelming to read a recommendation that's like, advocate for this at the legislature. And then I'm just like, oh, okay, how do I do that? Like, what do I do? What do I say? So they are large scale recommendations. And I think to go the next step of saying, how do we actually get to that, and pulling people together? This topic has always been timely, in my opinion, but I think that with the conversations on police brutality, I think people are looking more for to get out of their comfort zone and to do something brave. And I think we can only achieve these kinds of big things by coming together.
And yes, and before we leave, I want to say something about your work, Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
It is absolutely brilliant what you're doing.
It is.
And to bring the arts, music reaches the soul when you don't have words. It's just amazing. And so the healing, you're starting the healing process in prison, and also involving us. So I just want to say thank you so much for that.
I appreciate that comment. I mean, I would just add that my learning over doing that over the last 5 years has been, I think I started with this concept of healing. And then over time, I've realized more and more that a big part of what's happening is empowering people to use their voices.
Right.
And literally by practicing that in singing, especially in the context of women, many of whom have been told they don't have a voice, that reclaiming that has been extremely powerful, partly in this larger context of advocacy and reform. And so I think I've shared in some places, but just to say as a part of this forum that we're working towards creating a re-entry choir for women that would be a partnership between Voices of Hope and Westminster, and just really excited about ways not just that we can kind of give money somewhere or send a letter somewhere, but interact directly with people who are different from us, and ways that we can learn from one another. So I want to thank you both for your work on this statement and your continued passion for it. It's been so great to hear you talk about it today. And I hope that folks who have been a part of this session will come back for the next 5 weeks as we partner with people from McCormick Seminary in Chicago. We'll be looking at criminal justice, disconnection, and the church. And I think it will be quite an inspired series. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us today. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
Same here.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Bye. Bye, Vivian.
Bye.